One of the factors that often contributes to their sleep problems is people are so busy, they're going up until the time where it's time to go to bed, but they had no time to rest and relax before bed. And we need that transition point. So that kind of downtime, that rest time, not only is of value for itself, it then helps contribute to better sleep that night.
Welcome to Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of leadership: sleep. How does sleep, or the lack of it, impact a leader's ability to make decisions, inspire teams, and navigate challenges? To explore this critical topic, I'm honored to welcome my friend, Dr. Phil Gehrman. Dr. Gehrman is a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Sleep Neurobiology and Psychopathology Lab. His research focuses on how sleep impacts mental health, cognition, and overall performance, making him highly qualified to discuss why sleep is essential for effective leadership. This is definitely an episode you'll want to stay awake for. Phil, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, usually on the podcast, we launch our discussion by defining what we're talking about. But before I do that, I'm curious, how did you get into studying sleep? What's the story with that?
So, when I was an undergraduate in college, it was fall of my senior year, and I signed up to take this class on sleep. It sounded interesting. And the first day of class, the professor started by talking about the fact that we sleep about a third of every day, meaning in a given year, we'll have slept for roughly 120 days. If we live to the ripe old age of 90, we'll have slept for 30 years of our life. And that math just blew me away. But this was really early in the field of sleep research. It's a fairly young field. And we said, well, what is it for? And there were so many questions, basic questions about sleep we didn't know that I was just hooked.
Ah, you're right. I mean, for those of us who sleep about 8 hours a day, it's a third of our lives.
Hmm.
Some of us don't necessarily sleep that long. We'll get into that. But so thanks for sharing a little bit about that story. Now let's get down to actually talking about sleep. As I've thought about it, it seems to me that while on one hand, people know what sleep is, on the
Hmm.
other hand, there's so many studies that have shown that we live in a sleep deprived society. So maybe we really don't know what it means after all. Can you lay out for us what sleep should be as opposed to whatever it is that so many of us have become accustomed to?
Yeah. But we define sleep as basically a state of rest or in kind of a decoupling from the world around us. But people think historically that sleep is a very passive state. That's sort of like a light switch that at night your brain turns off. But we now have learned, especially a lot since I first had that class, that there's a ton that's going on during sleep. That sleep is actually while you're disconnected from the world, your brain and your body are doing a lot of things to physically recover from the day, to process kind of the new information you've taken in. And so it's a very active process that is really vital for many aspects of our physical and mental functioning.
There's a lot of information out there about sleep, what the ideal amount is, who needs how much, things like that. Personally, I feel like I may be wrong on this. I may have convinced myself of it, but I feel like the right amount for me is somewhere in the 6 to 6.5 hour range. But I've seen so much about ideal being more than that, 7.5 to 8 hours. And you mentioned a third of our lives in that. What's the reality on this question? How much do we really need? Is there some magical threshold?
So the average sleep need for most adults is around 7 to 8 hours. That's what the science is showing us right now. There is variability from person to person. So some people need more, some people need less. One of the challenges is we don't have any type of blood test or brain scan or something we can do to say, Tom, you need 6 hours, Phil, you need 8 hours. I'm about an 8 hour person for ideal. So we don't have a good way to kind of quantify what someone's baseline sleep need is. And the other piece of that, though, that we don't pay enough attention to is that we focus a lot on the quantity of sleep. We often don't focus enough on the quality of sleep
Yeah.
because you could get 9 hours of sleep a night, but if it's very poor quality, disrupted sleep, you're still not going to feel rested the next day.
Yeah. Okay. So jury's out, but maybe it's possible my 6 to 6.5 is okay.
It's
Um,
possible.
yeah, I've been wondering about that for a while. I feel like it works for me, but maybe I'm just convincing myself. As it pertains to sleep, do you have a good story that you can think of from either your own life or someone else's where regarding someone on the kind of extreme ends of the sleep spectrum and how that did or didn't affect them and their ability to perform?
Yeah. One of the things this is not so much an individual story, but of an individual study, actually, I was actually done here at my institution, not by me, where, they brought people into the lab, and they randomized them to one of 4 conditions, either total sleep deprivation for 3 days, so no sleep for 3 days, or 3 weeks of 8 hours in bed per night, 6 hours, or 4 hours. And what they found was in every group except those in bed for 8 hours per night, performance just degraded over the course of either the 3 days for the total sleep deprivation, but even on average, those in bed 6 hours per night, their performance degraded across the 3 weeks. But about a week and a half in, for those in bed 6 and 4 hours per night, their perception of how they were doing leveled off. And so there was this point at which they lost the ability to gauge how impaired they were. So they
Mm,
believed that they had adjusted, but actually they were continuing to get worse and worse. And so it suggested that people who, I mean, although there truly are people who need less sleep, that there may be these people who sometimes people who sleep less than 6 hours a night, we often refer to as short sleepers. And but some of these short sleepers are actually chronically impaired and they just don't know
mm. Okay. So maybe I'm chronically impaired and I just can't assess my capabilities.
it. It's possible.
I could be so much better than I am if I slept longer. That's what I'm hearing. Well, coming at this from a medical vantage point, and thinking about this, when we're ill, our metabolic demand, our energy needs really rev up, and we deplete energy stores, leading to tiredness, which usually translates to sleeping more. But I've been wondering about what if we're thinking all the time, right? Because for listeners, as leaders, thinking is a really important part of what we should be doing. When I did my study on 4-star officers, many of them said you have to set aside time to think because that's one of the most important things a leader can do. And so that's a huge part of what we're doing with regard to organizations and so forth, where we're going. Um, since our brains at baseline account for about 20% of our energy needs, and thinking increases that energy demand, it seems like spending a lot of time thinking would lead to a greater need for sleep. Am I kind of off on that, or what's the relationship between the mental demands of what we do and our need for sleep?
Yeah. Yeah, you're spot on with that. I mean, we historically have thought about sleep as a global process, meaning the whole brain's awake, the whole brain's asleep, that it's kind of a uniform across the brain. We now understand that at the what we call the local level, meaning at specific brain regions, that sleep is partly use dependent. And what I mean by that is if there's an area of the brain that has been more active than other areas of the brain, it will actually, that area will sleep more deeply than the surrounding brain
So
tissue
you, so you
around
have
it.
differential sleep depths.
Exactly.
Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't know that at all.
Yeah. So this area of my brain might sleep a little bit more deeply than this area of my brain because that area was more active during the day.
Yeah. Okay. Hmm. Well, certainly new information to me. Um, well, beyond the general idea of sleep, you've, you know, spoken more broadly about this concept of rest.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is and how it adds to what we're talking about here?
Yeah, this has been kind of a relatively recent shift in my thinking. I've spent so much of my career just thinking about the critical importance of getting a good night of sufficient quantity and quality of sleep that I didn't pay enough attention to what's really going on during our wakeful hours. And that even while we're awake, we're just not really built to be going all of our waking hours. That even during wakefulness, we need periods of rest and recuperation. And there's this kind of intricate interplay between sleep and rest. And so, for example, one of the problems I treat people with sleep problems, and one of the root factors that often contributes to their sleep problems is people are so busy, they're going up until the time where it's time to go to bed, but they had no time to rest and relax before bed. And we need that transition point. So that kind of downtime, that rest time, not only is of value for itself, it then helps contribute to better sleep that night. And so our resting during the day feeds into our ability to sleep at night and vice versa.
Yeah. I guess that gets to some of these recommendations about not watching TV, not doing things in bed that
Mhm,
aren't just sleep or, you know, Congress, if you will. Um, uh, as well as not looking at screens a certain
mhm,
period of time. And so that makes a lot of sense. I think we've been touching on the value, the importance of sleep, but could we be maybe more explicit here? Why is sleep and or rest so vitally important to us in general and more specifically for us as leaders?
yeah. So, we've really discovered a lot of different, like I said, a lot of different things that are going on during sleep that are really critical. But to highlight a few of them, one of them is there's a huge amount of evidence now that sleep is critical for learning and memory. So as you learn new information during the day, it's initially in this kind of fragile state, and it's during sleep that that information is transferred to long-term storage. And so there's lots of data showing that not getting a good night of sleep impairs the retention of new information and skills that you've learned during the day. So obviously, being able to remember the things you've learned is a critical skill as a
Mhm.
asset as a leader. Another aspect is that there are particular different areas of the brain are vary in how vulnerable they are to the effects of inadequate sleep. And one of the parts of the brain that seems most vulnerable to not getting enough sleep is our frontal cortex, the front of the brain, which is responsible for, it's called our executive functions,
Sure.
decision making, logic, planning, impulse control. So whenever I speak to leaders, I always say, like, the very cognitive functions you are most reliant on are the ones most sensitive to the effects of sleep loss.
Yeah. That leads me to a question that's been rolling around in my mind. I think it fits, and I've seen some data, but it's on and this will be just a little bit of a divergence for our listeners, but I think it's valuable because it ties into this. It's the idea of dementia
Mhm.
and the relationship between some data that I've seen,
Yeah.
the relationship between sleep over time and risk of dementia. And certainly, at least in most of the forms of dementia, the frontal cortex is really significantly impacted, right? So can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's been known for decades that people with various forms of dementia often sleep poorly. And in part, it seems to be because the various forms of dementia can target the areas of the brain that regulate sleep and wakefulness. About 6 or 7 years ago, though, there was a really fascinating discussion, or discovery that actually the arrow might go in the other direction as well, that, um, as we're awake and we're using our brain and it's metabolically active, like all of our organs, there are waste products produced as a result of that. But it really was not known until recently how the brain cleared away waste. We now understand that actually during sleep, and in particular our deeper sleep, that there's actually a flow of a cerebrospinal fluid that kind of washes the brain essentially. during sleep.
Hmm.
It flushes out those toxins that build up. And one of the toxins that's been studied most closely is a protein called beta amyloid, which, as you know, is one of the main proteins thought to cause Alzheimer's disease. And so studies in healthy adults show that one night of sleep deprivation led to a 20% increase of beta amyloid in the brain. And so there's kind of this growing body of evidence that if people are chronically not getting enough sleep over maybe years, that may actually be predisposing them to develop dementia.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. That was just something that had been rolling around in my mind, and
Yeah.
as you were talking about the frontal lobe and all, I was like, hey, let's just see what Phil's take is on this. So,
Yeah.
um, I can give a personal example of the impact of sleep deprivation. So, when I look back across my medical career, especially when I was in training, and had months where I was working 120 hours a week or more and sleeping sometimes 4, maybe 5 hours a night for weeks or months. I experienced the negative impacts of sleep deprivation. My decision making was impaired. I was irritable. I mean, I was irritable. That's probably putting it nicely. I didn't have the psychological energy really to do other things. And probably the clearest example of this was when I was a third year medical student doing my surgery rotation. So at that time, there were no work hour rules and things of that nature, and students were just supposed to be there learning. And I was doing a rotation away from the main campus at a secondary in another city. Great rotation. They had apartments for us, but the apartments were probably a 10-mile drive from the hospital or something. And I ended up spending most of my 2 months in the hospital, literally living in the hospital because I just one of the call rooms was empty and I just stayed there, and so and it got to the point where some of my classmates wouldn't answer the pager in the middle of the night if there was a trauma case or whatever, and the residents knew that I was there. And so they would page me even though I was not on call because they knew I would answer the page and I would come hold the stinking retractor and all this sort of stuff. And so I was just going. I mean, 120 hours a week of work is probably an underestimate, you know? And I thought, to your point earlier about you're not able to assess your own standing, right? You can't determine how well you're performing. I felt like I was doing great.
Mhm.
Things were going well. I didn't have any time for exercise or anything else because I was just in the OR or so forth. And and my buddy Dan, I mean, really good friend. He was in our wedding and so forth. One night he was like, "Hey man, we need to talk." Okay, you know. And he just sat me down and said, "You're being I'll make it, G-rated. You're being a really difficult person." Okay? Uh and and it just like it hit me like a ton of bricks, right? And I was emotional and all this sort of thing. Um and he was right. And it was because I was not sleeping at all. I was not taking care of myself, doing the other like exercising or eating well or any of that. And but principally I think it was just about the amount of sleep I wasn't getting. And so,
Yeah.
if I take how I was at that time and I try to put that into a leadership context, that would have been disastrous, right? No one will voluntarily follow someone who's being like that, right? In fact, most people, I can't say all, but most people would leave. So just from that experience and thought experiment, it's pretty clear to me that lack of sleep can be disastrous for leaders.
Yeah, and I'd agree completely. And if leadership were predictable, like if you knew, okay, tomorrow there's gonna be an important decision I need to make, and I'm gonna make sure I get extra sleep the night before. Well, if it was predictable like that, you could say, well, a lot of nights I'm not gonna get enough sleep, but I'll get it when I know something important is coming up. That's not really what leadership looks like. Leadership is being able to be prepared for the unexpected.
Yeah.
And so you never know when, when you were, living in the hospital, and that call comes in the middle of the night and you need to be able to think clearly and respond. That's just not realistic when you're sleep deprived. And so, regularly getting a good night of sleep is just really essential to be ready when those situations arise. I always love the term, a lot of the kind of really solid sleep deprivation studies historically were done by Gregory Belenky, who was a scientist at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And he called sleep a force multiplier.
Yeah.
And like that's I think just I've always loved that quote. Like that's just captures it right there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's force multiplier is something that is used a lot in military context. And so
Yeah.
I can understand his using that, probably geared toward a lot of people in the military to say, "Hey, look, you gotta sleep," as well as communicating outside scientifically. Are you familiar with the study by Olaf Olsen and his colleagues at the Royal Norwegian Naval Academy?
I don't think doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, they studied the effects of sleep deprivation actually on leadership behavior. And so in the study, it was published in 2016. I don't remember the journal. I'll link it in the description and all that for listeners. But over the course of their study, they found that both transformational and transactional leadership behaviors decreased in the people who were sleep deprived, whereas passive avoidant behaviors increased. And so those movements are in exactly the opposite direction of what we would want. And so that study, in addition to some of the others that you mentioned that we'll include in the show notes stuff, add credence to what we're talking about here, that sleep is absolutely vital for leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't imagine being in a more significant leadership role while being chronically sleep deprived.
Yeah. Well, Phil, now that we've grounded our conversation in the science, maybe let's turn toward achieving the rest, the good sleep that we all clearly need. From your vantage point, what are the practices you would recommend for maximizing rest and high quality sleep?
So the first step, of course, is just having sufficient opportunity for sleep. Meaning, like if you're just not spending enough hours in bed, then that's the first criterion. So making bottom line is making sleep a priority. The last few years, a lot of research seems to be showing that one of the keys is the regularity. That it's not like, well, some nights I get a good night of sleep, some nights it's a bad night of sleep. It's that consistency, both in terms of hours of sleep, but also in terms of sleep schedule. So trying to follow a fairly consistent bedtime, fairly consistent wake up time. It doesn't have to be like exactly the same time every day, but consistency seems to be really important.
Yeah.
Um, you touched before, Tom, on kind of that, like some of the practices as you prepare for bed. Most of us need a good 30 to 60 minutes of rest, winding down, relaxing activities before bed, um, minimizing our use of screens, especially close to the face. It's like not being on emails or social media right up until bedtime, but giving our body and our brain that time to prepare for sleep. Because otherwise, like, you might fall asleep, but those thoughts of the day can just follow you into sleep and keep you from getting the quality deep sleep that you need. And I guess one more that I'll add is that you can't force sleep to happen. So if it's a night that you're having difficulty sleeping at the beginning of the night or at the middle of the night, typically what we do is we just lie there and we try harder and harder to sleep. But of course, the harder we try to sleep, the harder it is to actually sleep. So I always tell people, if you find yourself in bed, sleep's not happening, and you're just starting to really focus on your sleep and put that effort into sleeping, is to actually take a break, to get up, go to another room ideally, do something relaxing until you feel ready for bed again. That you're actually probably gonna get back to sleep faster than if you just stay in bed tossing and turning.
Yeah. I think those are excellent tips. I appreciate you laying those out. I'm going to jump in here and share a personal experience with sleep that you know about, and how sometimes the answer is, from my perspective, ridiculously simple. So it was about what, a year, 18 months ago, something like that. I was just having the worst time waking up every morning or every night, whatever you want to say, at 2:30, okay, in the middle of the night. And I know that because I would wake up, I would lay there, I would look over at the clock, and it would say 2:30. And then I would do exactly what you said. I would work to go to sleep. Go to sleep, and I would get agitated at myself because not gonna perform well today because I haven't slept well, and all this sort of thing. So it was this cycle, and this went on for months. I would say probably 6 months or more, and finally I thought, "Hey, what am I doing? I got this friend who's like a world expert on sleep. Maybe I should ask him for some recommendations." So, and this is where it pays to have, a leading authority on sleep as a friend. But you were kind enough to give me a few, thoughts and recommendations, and you recommended a book called Quiet Your Mind and Get to Sleep. I read it, through, and then I made it's ridiculous, a single intervention that really changed my sleep sense. I got rid of the bedside clock. That way, when I woke up, I no longer had the clock telling me, "Hey, you're a terrible sleeper," or whatever. "Hey, it's 2:30. You're gonna have a bad day." I didn't have anything tangible saying I should be asleep or any of that stuff. And so I woke up, there was no clock, went back to sleep. I mean, it was insane the impact that one seemingly meaningless intervention had on my sleep. And if somebody would have told me on the front end, I would have probably thought they were ridiculous. And then to your point, this morning, um, well, last night, I'm working on all the different factors that go into getting this book published, and I was doing that right up until, I have a schedule, right up until, 15 minutes before I was going to go to sleep. And so got finished, got in bed, I went to sleep, but then I woke up at like somewhere around 3:45.
Mhm.
And I was there for a few minutes, and I was like, "I'm not gonna go back to sleep." And I just got up and, I didn't do what you said, I didn't do something relaxing. I got up and started working on stuff for my PhD program, but anyway, I didn't just lay there
Yeah,
to that point, so
yeah, yeah, and that captures, I think, the experience of people so often that, I always say, no one ever tells me that when they look at the clock in the middle of the night, that it's good news. That, you look at the clock, you see what time it is, and most people, the next thing they do is math because 'cause they're looking, they're saying it's 2:30 in the morning, my alarm is set for 6, that gives me, no one says, "Oh, I have all this time to sleep and feel better and drift off to sleep." The clock is always bad news.
yeah. Something that's fascinating, that I've experienced several times, and I've wondered what the right move is. There are times that I've awakened, I'll go to sleep at let's say 10:30 or even 11, and some people are like, "Man, that guy goes to bed early." But anyway, you know, and I will sleep so soundly, get the best night's rest, and then wake up at 12:30 a.m. and be like totally like rejuvenated and ready to go. And then I discover that it's 12:30 in the night, and I feel compelled to try to keep sleeping. And is any answer as to whether that's the wise thing or not?
Yeah, so that can be tricky sometimes, especially, like, if that wake up is happening an hour or 2 before your alarm is set to go off, not 12:30 at night, where it's like, "Well, should I go back to sleep? Should I just get up?" What I suspect is happening a lot of the times is, we go through these cycles
Yeah,
of sleep over the course of the night, roughly 90 minutes in length, and at the end of each sleep cycle, where is a time where we're more likely to wake up just naturally, and so if it's and so but then if you go back to sleep and get into a deep part of your sleep cycle, and then your alarm goes off, well, then sometimes you would have been better off just getting up, and so it's been really hard for me to come up with, like, hard and fast rules about it,
yeah,
But I think, I mean, 12:30 at night, I think you probably were at the end of a sleep cycle, but that early, it's worth trying to go back to sleep. But if it's approaching your wake up time anyway, you might be better off just getting up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then what I did this morning probably was the right thing to do. Um, okay. Well, Phil, before we wrap up our discussion, do you have any kind of takeaway or final thoughts for folks with regard to sleep and leadership?
Yeah. I think people see sleep as a waste of time. And I feel like attitudes are starting to change. We're seeing more and more leaders saying, no, sleep is important. But I would say, there's so much going on in your brain and your body during sleep that it's a very, like I said, a very active process. It's like a physical and mental workout when you're at night. And so rather than seeing sleep as a waste of time, I'm always trying to encourage people to see sleep as enjoyable in its own, but often as just a way that you prepare yourself to lead the next day.
I mean, I think that's a great note to end on, Phil. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the Science of Leadership today. Uh, Thanks for being here, and I really appreciate your friendship.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.